The dust of the road tasted like misery. It was a fine, gritty powder that clung to the back of the throat, a constant reminder of the barren land and the even more barren men who ruled it. In the center of this desolation, in a town that was little more than a collection of sagging clapboards and soured dreams, a woman stood on a block of wood. Her name was Leila, though no one had used it for some time. To the men gathered before her, she was an asset, a debt, a final ledger entry for a father who had gambled away everything, including his own daughter. Her dress was thin, her hands bound loosely with a length of rough rope, more for show than for security. There was nowhere for her to run. The Hollister brothers, who had held her father's markers, leered from the porch of the saloon. Jedediah, the eldest, was a thick man whose cruelty was etched into the deep lines around his mouth. He held a piece of paper, the bill of sale for a human soul. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed perilously close to the hem of Lila's dress. She did not flinch. She had learned that stillness was a form of armor. The bidding was slow, punctuated by crude jokes and the clinking of glasses from within the saloon. Men appraised her as they would a horse, noting the line of her back, the strength they imagined in her hands. She met their gazes with a cold emptiness, a void she had cultivated to protect the last piece of herself they could not touch. Then a figure detached itself from the shadows of the livery stable. He was an older man, his face a road map of hardship, his hair shot through with gray. He moved with a quiet economy that made no sound on the dusty ground. The crowd shifted, murmuring. This was Elias Thorne, a man who kept to himself in a cabin deep in the northern woods, a man who was spoken of in whispers. Some said he had been a lawman, others a killer. All agreed he was not a man to be trifled with. Elias stopped before the block, his eyes not on the leering brothers or the jeering crowd, but on Lila. It was a strange look, not of lust or ownership, but of something else, something heavy and ancient, like a stone at the bottom of a river. He did not look at her body, but at her hands, at the rope, at the defiant set of her jaw. Jedediah Hollister smirked. "Well, look what the crows dragged in. Come to place a bid, old man?" Elias's gaze shifted to Jedediah, and the smirk on the larger man's face faltered. The air grew thick and still. The jeers died in men's throats. Elias reached into a warm leather pouch at his belt. The crowd leaned in, expecting a handful of silver, a serious offer. Instead, he produced a single coin. It was not gold, not even silver. It was a dull, copper piece, worth less than a loaf of bread. He flipped it into the air. It landed with a soft puff in the dust at Jedediah's feet. "That's my price," Elias said. His voice was low, gravelly, like stones grinding together. It was the first time he had spoken. The sound seemed to silence the world. Laughter started to bubble up, nervous and uncertain, but it died when Jedediah looked from the coin to Elias's face. He saw no joke there. He saw no madness. He saw a finality, a promise of violence so assured it needed no threat. The air was tense, a wire pulled taut. Jedediah's hand hovered over the pistol at his hip. Elias did not move. He simply stood there, a pillar of silent resolve. The silence stretched. Jedediah's gaze darted to his brothers, who offered no support. They were watching Elias as a rabbit watches a hawk. Jedediah was a bully, but he was not a fool. He knew a losing fight when he saw one. His face turned a mottled red. With a snarled curse, he bent down, snatched the paper from the block, and shoved it into Elias's chest. "She's yours," he spat, as if the words themselves were poison. "Take the wretch. More trouble than she's worth." Elias took the paper without looking at it. He stepped onto the block, and with a simple touch of his knife, cut the rope from Lila's wrists. He did not speak to her. He did not look at her. He simply turned and started walking back the way he came. For a moment, Lila remained frozen, the broken rope dangling from her hands. The crowd stared, bewildered. She was free, but she had been sold, saved, but claimed. She looked at Elias's retreating back, a straight, unyielding line against the setting sun. She had been passed from one cage to another, and she did not know if this new one would be any better. With no other choice left in the world, she gathered the tattered edges of her dignity, stepped off the block, and followed the silent man into the growing twilight. The town watched her go, a ghost leaving a graveyard, and no one said a word. The journey was a silent one. Elias walked ahead, his pace steady and untiring, never once looking back to see if she followed. He did not need to. Her footsteps, light and hesitant at first, then resigned, were a constant whisper behind him. They left the sad little town and moved into the vast, unforgiving landscape of the high plains. The world grew larger, emptier. The sky was a brutal, endless blue. Leila had never known such silence. With the Hollisters, the air had been thick with threats, with crude laughter, with the constant noise of men asserting their dominance. This silence was different. It was not empty, but full. It was weighted with the rustle of sagebrush, the cry of a distant hawk, the crunch of Elias's boots on the dry earth. It was a silence that made her feel small, but also, strangely, unseen. She had been stared at, prodded, and appraised for so long that to be ignored felt like a perverse form of respect. He treated her not as a woman or a possession, but as a shadow he was contractually obligated to lead. He stopped only once as the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder, drank from it, and then set it on a rock between them. He turned his back, looking out over the valley, granting her the privacy to drink without his eyes on her. The water was cool and clean. It was the first act of something that was not cruelty she had received in months. She drank deeply, the simple gesture lodging in her chest like a splinter. He was her owner. He had bought her for a copper coin. Yet he had not touched her, had not spoken a harsh word, had not even bound her hands for the journey. The mystery of him was more terrifying than the certainty of the Hollister's brutality. A known monster is a thing you can prepare for. An unknown one leaves the imagination to run wild with horrors. They walked until the last light of day had faded and the stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the blackness. They came to a small, sheltered grove of cottonwoods by a creek. Elias dropped his pack. He gathered wood with an efficient, practiced grace, and soon had a small fire crackling. The flames pushed back the immense darkness, creating a tiny island of warmth and light. He took a strip of dried meat from his pack, cooked it on a stick over the fire, and handed it to her without a word. He then took out a bedroll and laid it out on the far side of the fire. For himself, he had only a thin blanket. He sat with his back against a tree, his rifle across his lap, and watched the shadows. Leila ate the meat slowly, her eyes fixed on him. Was he her protector or her jailer? The firelight played across his weathered face, revealing lines of sorrow she hadn't seen in the harsh light of town. This was a man who had known grief. It lived in the quiet set of his shoulders and the hollowness of his gaze. She finished the meat and curled up in the bedroll, pulling it tight around her. It was warmer and softer than anything she had slept on in a year. She expected to lie awake, her body rigid with fear, listening for any sign of his approach. But the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the fire, the vast silence of the wilderness around them, and the bone-deep exhaustion from her ordeal conspired against her. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first she had known in what felt like a lifetime. When she awoke, the sun was just beginning to crest the mountains. The fire was a pile of gray ash. Elias was gone. A moment of pure cold panic seized her. Had he abandoned her? Was this some cruel test? Then she saw him. He was standing in the creek, the cold morning water swirling around his knees. He was washing his face and hands, the simple domestic act at odds with the dangerous image he projected. He had left his rifle by the dead fire, next to another piece of dried meat and the canteen. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps of supreme confidence that she posed no threat. He saw her watching and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He waded out of the creek, collected his things, and without a word started walking north again. Lila ate the meat, drank the water, and followed. The pattern was set. For 2 more days they traveled this way, in a cocoon of shared silence. They were 2 solitary figures moving through an immense landscape, bound by a transaction neither of them ever spoke of. On the 3rd day, as they crested a ridge, she saw it. Nestled in a valley below was a small, solitary cabin, a thread of smoke rising from its stone chimney. It was surrounded by a sturdy-looking fence, and beyond it a barn leaned against the side of a hill. This, she knew, was the end of the journey. This was her new cage. The cabin was not a cage. It was simply a place. 4 walls of hewn logs, a stone hearth, a single window that looked out onto the vast, silent valley. It was stark, masculine, and meticulously clean. A simple bed stood in one corner, a handmade table, and 2 chairs in the center. There were no decorations, no personal touches, save for a row of well-cared-for tools hanging by the fireplace. Elias held the door open for her, a gesture so simple and yet so unexpected it made her pause on the threshold. He did not follow her in. He pointed to the table, where a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a pitcher of water sat waiting. Then he turned and walked towards the barn, his footsteps receding until there was only the sound of the wind sighing through the pines. Leela stood in the middle of the room, her senses overwhelmed. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine, not of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. The floor beneath her feet was solid and swept clean. It was a house, a home, but it was not hers. She was an intruder, a piece of property stored within its walls. She did not touch the food. She did not sit on the chair. She stood by the window for what felt like hours, watching as Elias moved about the homestead. He worked with a relentless rhythmic purpose. He checked the fence line, his hands moving with practiced ease over the wooden posts and wire. He split firewood, the axe rising and falling in a steady, powerful arc. He disappeared into the barn and emerged leading a single placid horse, which he groomed with slow, deliberate strokes. He never looked towards the cabin. He never acknowledged her presence at the window. It was as if he had brought her here and then forgotten her entirely. The sun began to set, painting the valley in hues of orange and purple. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. She finally moved to the table, broke off a small piece of bread, and ate it. It was dense and nutty. The water was cold and clean. She sat on one of the chairs, her back ramrod straight, and waited. Darkness fell. He did not come. Through the window, she saw a lantern flicker to life in the barn. He was sleeping there. He was giving her the house. The realization settled over her, not with relief, but with a profound and unsettling confusion. This was not the behavior of a man who had bought a woman to be his slave or his bed warmer. This was the behavior of she didn't know what. The first few days passed in this strange, silent rhythm. Each morning, she would find food left on the small porch outside the cabin door. A brace of rabbits, a few eggs, a pail of fresh milk. She would take them inside, and he would go about his day. The silence in the cabin began to feel less like an empty space and more like a weight. She had been stripped of her purpose. With the Hollisters, her purpose had been to endure, to survive. Here, there was nothing to fight against. There was only waiting. On the 4th day, she could bear it no longer. The need to do something, to create order, to impose a piece of herself onto her surroundings, became an unbearable ache. She started by cleaning. She scrubbed the floor until the wood gleamed. She washed the single window until the light streamed in, unobstructed. She found a small vegetable patch behind the cabin, neglected but not dead. She spent the afternoon on her knees, pulling weeds, her hands sinking into the cool, dark earth. It felt good. It felt real. That evening, she took one of Elias's shirts from a peg by the door. It was torn at the elbow. In a small chest, she found a needle and thread. She sat by the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the walls, and she mended the shirt. Her stitches were small and neat. It was a skill her mother had taught her a lifetime ago. When she was finished, she folded it carefully and placed it on the back of the chair he never used. The next morning, when she opened the door to find the usual offering of food, the mended shirt was gone. In its place, sitting on the porch rail, was a small, roughly carved block of pine and a sharp whittling knife. There was no note. There were no words. But the message was as clear as if he had shouted it across the valley. He had seen her work, and he had answered with a task of her own. She picked up the wood. It was smooth and cool in her hand. She did not know what to make, but she knew it was a beginning. The piece of pine sat on the table for 2 days. Leila would pick it up, feel its weight, run her thumb over the smooth grain, and then set it back down. The knife lay beside it, a glint of steel that felt like a question she didn't know how to answer. What did he want her to make? What did he expect? Her life had been one of reaction, of deflecting blows and enduring cruelty. The simple act of creation felt foreign, a language she had forgotten how to speak. She watched him from the window. He had a language of his own, and it was all in his hands. He reshod the horse, the rhythmic clang of hammer on steel echoing through the valley. He repaired a sagging roof on the barn, his movements patient and precise. One evening, as dusk settled, she saw him sitting on the porch of the barn, a piece of wood in his own hands. He was carving. She couldn't see what it was from a distance, only the slow, careful curl of wood shavings falling at his feet. He was not a man of idle hands. Everything he did had a purpose, a quiet intensity. He was building, mending, maintaining. He was holding this small patch of the world together through sheer force of will. Inspired by this, on the 3rd day, she picked up the knife. Her first attempts were clumsy. The blade skipped, cutting too deep or not at all. She was trying to force the wood into a shape it did not want to take. Frustrated, she almost threw it into the fire. But then she remembered watching him work. His movements were never forced. He seemed to listen to the materials in his hands, whether it was iron or leather or wood. She closed her eyes, took a breath, and tried again. This time, she let the knife follow the grain. She shaved off thin, whispery curls of pine. Slowly, an image began to form in her mind. A bird, a small, simple sparrow, its head cocked as if listening. The work was slow. It consumed her evenings. While Elias worked outside, she worked inside. They were 2 solitary artisans, separated by a few dozen yards of earth, but connected by the shared act of making. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a workshop. It began to feel like hers. She found a rhythm to her days. She tended the small garden, coaxing green shoots from the soil. She cooked the food he left for her, learning to make bread in the hearth oven. She mended her own clothes, her stitches growing stronger and more confident. She was building a life, not the one she had lost, but a new one, crafted from the materials at hand. One afternoon, a sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled through the pines. Rain lashed against the cabin in sheets. It was the first time the weather had felt truly threatening. The door to the cabin burst open, driven by a gust of wind, and Elias stood on the threshold, dripping wet, his face grim. "The roof of the barn," he said, his voice rough against the roar of the storm. "A section's come loose." It'll tear the whole thing off if I don't secure it. He was not asking for her help. He was stating a fact. But Lila was already on her feet. She grabbed a spare oilskin coat from a peg and followed him out into the maelstrom. The wind and rain were a physical force, stealing her breath and trying to tear her from her feet. The barn was a groaning, shuddering beast. A large section of the roof was flapping wildly, held on by a few stubborn nails. Elias had a ladder propped against the side, but it was slick with rain, bucking in the wind. "Hold the ladder," he yelled over the storm. "Hold it steady." She threw her whole weight against it, her feet sinking into the mud, her knuckles white as she gripped the wet wood. Elias climbed, a hammer and a pouch of nails hooked to his belt. He moved with a terrifying sureness, never hesitating, even as the wind tried to rip him from his perch. Above her, he was a dark silhouette against the angry sky, battling the storm. He worked with a furious efficiency. The sound of his hammer blows a desperate counterpoint to the thunder. She watched, her heart pounding, not with fear for herself, but for him. In that moment, he was not her owner, not her jailer. He was just a man on a roof in a storm, and she was the only thing keeping him from falling. He secured the last plank, just as a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in a stark, momentary flash. The thunder that followed was a physical blow, shaking the very ground beneath them. Elias scrambled down the ladder, his face pale and grim in the lashing rain. They half ran, half stumbled back to the cabin, collapsing inside as the storm raged on. The warmth of the hearth was a shock after the bone-deep cold outside. They stood dripping on the floor, the silence between them now charged with a new energy. They had faced something together. They had weathered the same storm. "Thank you," he said. The two words were quiet, almost lost in the sound of the rain drumming on the roof, but they landed in the small room with the weight of a covenant. Lila could only nod, her throat tight. She busied herself by adding logs to the fire, the simple task a way to ground herself. Elias took off his soaking coat and hung it by the hearth. He was shivering, his shirt plastered to his skin. For the first time, she saw vulnerability in him. He was not an unstoppable force of nature. He was a man, made of flesh and blood, susceptible to the cold. "You should get out of those wet clothes," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned her back, affording him the same quiet dignity he had always afforded her. She heard the rustle of clothing, the soft sound of him wrapping himself in a dry blanket from the bed. When she turned back, he was sitting in one of the chairs by the fire, his back to her, staring into the flames. The storm continued its assault on their small sanctuary, but inside, a fragile peace began to settle. The shared danger had broken something open between them. The carefully constructed walls of silence and distance had been breached. Lila poured 2 mugs of hot water and placed one on the table beside him. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the firelight. The question that had haunted her for weeks finally found its voice. "Why?" she asked, her voice soft but clear. "Why did you buy me?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze returning to the fire. The flames danced in his eyes, reflecting a sorrow that seemed bottomless. "That's a cage," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I know that cage." He did not elaborate. He did not need to. In those few words, she glimpsed a history as scarred and weathered as his face. He had not bought her to own her. He had bought her to free her in the only way he knew how. He was not her jailer. He was a fellow prisoner who had found a key. Later that night, as the storm began to subside, Lila was jolted from a light sleep by a sound from the other side of the room. It was a choked cry, a wordless expression of pain. She sat up. In the dim glow of the dying embers, she saw Elias thrashing in his chair, caught in the grip of a nightmare. He was lost in a place she could not see, fighting a battle from long ago. She rose and crossed the room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She did not touch him. She did not speak. She simply knelt before the hearth and gently added a few small pieces of kindling to the embers. She blew on them softly, coaxing them back to life. A small, steady flame flickered, then grew, pushing back the shadows. The light seemed to reach him in his sleep. His thrashing subsided. His breathing evened out. He sank back into a peaceful quiet. She stayed there, kneeling by the fire, watching over him until the first gray light of dawn broke through the clouds. The storm was over. Something new was beginning. The morning after the storm was clean and quiet. The air, washed by the rain, smelled of wet earth and pine. A fragile truce had been forged in the wind and the thunder. When Eliza awoke, he found her sitting in the other chair, the small, half-finished carving of the bird in her hands. He looked from her to the carefully tended fire, and a silent understanding passed between them. The rigid separation of cabin and barn began to dissolve. He no longer left the food on the porch, but brought it to the table. They began to eat their meals together, in the same familiar silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was comfortable, companionable. It was the quiet of two people who did not need words to understand one another. One evening, as she worked on the carving, the knife slipped, gashing her thumb. It was not a deep cut, but it bled freely. She gasped, dropping the knife and the bird. Before she could react, Eliza was there. He took her hand gently, his touch surprisingly soft. His large, calloused fingers dwarfed her own as he examined the cut. He went to a small wooden chest in the corner, a place she had never looked inside, and took out a clean strip of linen and a small tin of dark, pungent salve. He cleaned the wound with water, his movements economical and sure. He applied the salve, which stung for a moment and then soothed and wrapped her thumb neatly in the linen. He did it all without a word, his focus entirely on the task. But his touch lingered for a moment, longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgment of her pain. "You have to respect the blade," he said, his voice low. "It has no loyalty. It only knows how to cut." He picked up the little wooden bird and turned it over in his hands. It was nearly complete. The wings were folded, the head tilted, the tiny body full of a life she had coaxed from the wood. "It's a good likeness," he said, a rare and startling compliment. He handed it back to her. "Finish it." The valley settled into a peaceful rhythm. The days grew longer, warmer. The garden she tended began to produce small green vegetables. The mended fence held strong. The patch on the barn roof was a dark, neat square against the weathered wood. They had built a world together, small and isolated, but secure. It was a peace too perfect to last. One bright, cloudless afternoon, she saw them. 3 riders, silhouetted against the sky on the ridge, where she and Elias had first looked down into the valley. Even from a distance, she recognized the lumbering shape of Jedediah Hollister. Her blood ran cold. The past had found them. She ran to the barn where Elias was mending a piece of harness. She didn't need to speak. He saw her face, followed her gaze to the ridge, and the placid calm dropped from him like a cloak. The man who stood there now was the man from the town, the man who had silenced a jeering crowd with a single look. "Go inside," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Lock the door. But go." He took his rifle from the pegs on the wall, checked the action, and strode out to meet them, a solitary figure of defiance in the vast, open field. She did as he asked, her hands trembling as she slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. She ran to the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The 3 riders came down the slope slowly, arrogantly. They stopped a short distance from Elias. She could not hear their words, but she could read the menace in their posture. Jedediah was talking, gesturing with his hand towards the cabin. He was pointing at her. He was demanding his property back. Elias stood his ground, the rifle held loosely in one hand. He was not pointing it. He did not need to. His stance was a weapon in itself. She saw him shake his head. She saw his jaw set. The conversation was short. Jedediah's face contorted with rage. He spat on the ground, shouted something, and wheeled his horse around. His two companions followed, casting dark looks back at the cabin. They rode back up the ridge and disappeared over the top. For a long moment, Elias did not move. He stood watching the empty ridge, as if to be certain they were truly gone. Then he turned and walked slowly back to the cabin. His face was a mask of cold fury. "They'll be back," he said, as he stepped inside. "They won't come with words next time." The peace was shattered. The small, quiet world they had built was about to be washed away in a tide of violence. The air in the valley changed. The lazy warmth of the afternoon was replaced by a cold, sharp tension. The threat lingered on the ridge, an unspoken promise. The time for silent companionship was over. Now was the time for preparation. Elias did not suggest that she run. He did not offer to hide her. He had not brought her all this way to let her be taken again. This was his land, and she was under his protection. The unspoken vow he had made with a single copper coin was about to be paid in full. He moved with a grim, methodical purpose. He disassembled his rifle on the main table, cleaning each piece with oiled rags until the metal gleamed. He checked every cartridge, his hands steady and sure. He took the heavy axe from its block outside and spent an hour sharpening the blade on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a grating, ominous sound that filled the small cabin. He was preparing for war. Leela watched him, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. But beneath the fear, something else was stirring, a slow-burning anger. These men, the Hollisters, had taken her father's life, her home, her name. They had tried to sell her soul. They believed she was a thing, an object to be claimed and used. They were wrong. She would not be a passive victim, cowering in a corner while a man fought her battles for her. This was her home now, too. She had scrubbed its floors, tended its garden, mended its roof. She had a stake in this land, in this life. She went to the hearth and began to work. She filled every pot and bucket with water and set them to boil over a roaring fire. The cabin grew hot and steamy, the air thick with the smell of wood smoke. She took the kitchen knives, the butcher knife, the paring knife, and sharpened them on the edge of the stone hearth until they were as sharp as razors. She checked the heavy wooden bolt on the door, noted the way the window latches worked. She was not a warrior. She did not know how to fire a rifle or wield an axe. But she was a survivor. She knew how to use the tools she had. Elias stopped his work and watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable. He saw the grim determination in her eyes, the set of her jaw. He saw not a frightened woman, but a partner. A silent acknowledgment passed between them. They were in this together. As twilight began to fall, casting long, deep shadows across the valley, Elias walked over to her. He had the small wooden bird in his hand. He had finished it. He had smoothed the last rough edges, oiled the wood until it shone with a soft, warm luster. It was a perfect, beautiful thing, full of grace and potential flight. He held it out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. The bird was warm from his hand. It was a gift, a promise of a future, of a freedom they were now about to fight for. "They'll come after dark," he said. "They'll think the shadows are their friend." He looked at her, his gaze direct and heavy. "Stay away from the window. Stay away from the door. When it starts, get down." He turned and walked to the door, took the heavy bar down, and stepped outside into the growing darkness. He did not go far. He settled himself into the shadows of the porch, the rifle resting across his lap, and became as still and silent as the stones around him. He was waiting. Layla clutched the wooden bird in her hand, its smooth, rounded shape a small comfort in the terrifying quiet. The water on the fire bubbled and hissed. The cabin was a fortress, and outside, the hunter had become the prey. The long, agonizing wait began. The darkness was absolute. The moon was a sliver, hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The only light was the faint, flickering glow from the cabin's single window, a solitary beacon in a sea of black. It was a trap, and Elias was the bait. He sat motionless on the porch, his senses stretched to their limit. He was not listening for the sound of horses. The Hollisters would be too smart for that. They would come on foot, slinking through the trees like the predators they were. He listened for the unnatural silence, the snap of a twig that did not belong, the whisper of cloth against brush. Hours passed. The world held its breath. Inside, Leela waited. The heat from the fireplace was stifling. The water in the pot simmered, sending plumes of steam into the small room. She held the heaviest kitchen knife in her hand, its handle slick with the sweat from her palm. She had moved a heavy chest of drawers in front of the window, leaving only a small gap to peer through. She was not going to hide. She was going to watch. The first sign was a flicker of movement at the edge of the woods, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. Then another, and another. There were 4 of them. They must have brought a cousin. They moved in a low crouch, spreading out, intending to surround the small cabin. They thought him an old man, alone. They thought it would be easy. Elias did not move. He let them get closer. He let their confidence grow. He could smell the sour scent of cheap whiskey on the night air. One of them, bolder than the rest, broke from the tree line and made a dash for the side of the cabin, aiming for the blind spot beneath the window. The rifle in Elias's lap came up in a single fluid motion. There was no shouted warning, no challenge, only the deafening crack of the shot, a tongue of fire that split the night. The running man crumpled without a sound, a dark shape on the ground. Pandemonium erupted. Curses and shouts echoed from the darkness. The element of surprise was gone, replaced by blind fury. A muzzle flashed from behind a large pine tree, the bullet thudding into the log wall of the cabin, inches from where Elias had been sitting. But he was no longer there. He had melted into the deeper shadows at the end of the porch, a ghost in the night. Another man, Jedediah, roared a challenge. "Come out and fight, you coward," Elias answered with silence. He was patient. He let their anger and fear make them reckless. 2 of them broke cover at once, charging the cabin from different directions, firing wildly. Their shots went high, splintering the roof shingles. Elias's rifle spoke again, a calm, measured report. The second man went down, clutching his leg, screaming. Now there were 2, Jedediah and one other. They were pinned down, their plan in tatters. "He's just one man," Jedediah bellowed, his voice laced with a frantic edge. "Rush him." The remaining brother hesitated, but a snarled command from Jedediah sent him scrambling forward. He ran low, a pistol in his hand, his eyes fixed on the porch. From inside, Leela watched him come. He was going to make it to the door. Elias was reloading, hidden in the shadows. This one would reach the cabin. As the man lunged for the door, she acted. She grabbed the largest pot of boiling water from the hearth, her hands protected by thick rags. With a strength born of pure adrenaline, she wrenched the door open just as the man reached it and hurled the scalding contents into his face. His scream was inhuman, a sound of pure agony that was cut short as Elias's rifle fired a 3rd time. Now there was only one, Jedediah. He was alone, his men dead or dying around him, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only raw, primal fear. He fired his pistol wildly into the darkness, then turned and ran, a lumbering, terrified shape crashing back towards the safety of the woods. Elias did not shoot him in the back. He rose from the shadows, a specter of vengeance, and followed him into the night. The sounds of the fight faded, replaced by an unnerving quiet. The screaming had stopped. The gunfire was over. All Leela could hear was the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. She stood in the middle of the room, the empty pot still in her hands, her body trembling with the aftershock of violence. She had done it. She had fought back. The woman who had stood silently on the auction block was gone, burned away in the heat and the fury of the last few minutes. She peered through the gap in the window. The night was still and dark. 3 shapes lay unmoving on the ground her home was built on. There was no sign of Elias or Jedediah Hollister. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Had Elias been hurt? Was he lying wounded in the darkness? Or had Hollister, in his desperation, managed to get the best of him? The thought was a cold spike of fear in her gut. She could not bear the waiting. She unbolted the door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and death. She forced herself not to look at the bodies. She looked towards the woods, straining her ears for any sound, and then she heard it, a single heavy footstep. A figure emerged from the tree line, walking slowly, deliberately, back towards the light of the cabin. It was Elias. He was alone. He moved with a slight limp, and his left arm was pressed tight against his side, but he was walking. He was alive. Relief washed over her so powerfully, her knees felt weak. She met him at the edge of the porch. In the faint light from the doorway, she could see a dark stain spreading across his shirt, high on his shoulder. His face was grim, etched with pain and exhaustion, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her, at the pot she had used, at the resolve in her stance. "It's over," he said, his voice ragged. He won't be back. Jedediah Hollister's reign of cruelty was ended. He would trouble no one ever again. Elias leaned heavily against a porch post, a deep sigh shuddering through his body. The immense tension of the fight, the years of coiled readiness, seemed to drain out of him all at once, leaving him depleted and vulnerable. He looked not like a killer, but like a weary old man. "Help me inside," he whispered. She put her arm around his waist, taking some of his weight. He was heavier than he looked, solid as oak. She guided him into the cabin, into the warmth and the light, and bolted the door behind them. The fortress had held. The war was won. He sank into a chair by the fire, his head lolling back, his eyes closing. The adrenaline was gone, and the pain was setting in. Leela looked at the man who had bought her, protected her, and fought for her. The roles were now completely reversed. He had been her protector. Now she would be his. She gently took a knife and began to cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. Her hands were steady. Her fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, unwavering purpose. She had a life to save. The bullet had gone clean through, a ragged tear in the flesh and muscle of his shoulder. It was a nasty wound, bleeding sluggishly, but it could have been so much worse. Leela worked with a focus she didn't know she possessed. She washed the wound with the last of the hot water, her touch gentle but firm. Elias gritted his teeth, his knuckles white where he gripped the arm of the chair, but he made no sound. She remembered the salve he had used on her thumb, the dark, pungent stuff from the wooden chest. She found it and applied it liberally to the wound, and bound it tightly with clean strips of linen she tore from a bedsheet. Her hands, which had trembled with fear just an hour before, were now the hands of a healer. They were sure and capable. As she worked, she saw the scars. His back and chest were a road map of old violence. A long, puckered line across his ribs that could only have come from a knife. A trio of small, round scars on his side, pale and old. This was not the first battle he had fought. He was a man who had lived his life in the shadow of violence, both given and received. When she was finished, she helped him to the bed. He lay back with a sigh, the deep lines of pain on his face softening slightly with exhaustion. She pulled a blanket over him. The silence returned to the cabin, but it was a different silence yet again. It was the quiet of the aftermath, of shared trauma and survival. It was a silence filled with unspoken things, with gratitude, with a bond forged in blood and fire. She sat in the chair by the bed, the one he had slept in during the storm, and watched him. She would not sleep. She would keep vigil. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the sky, his eyes fluttered open. They were lucid, clear. He looked at her, sitting there, a silent guardian. "My wife," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "And my son." The words hung in the air, a confession, an explanation. A ghost story told at sunrise. It was men like him, not Hollister, but the same kind. Men who believe the world and everyone in it belongs to them. He paused, gathering his strength. It wasn't a debt of money. It was a debt of pride, a perceived slight. They came to our farm. I wasn't there. I was in town, buying seed. His voice broke, just for a moment, a single crack in the stone facade. He cleared his throat and continued, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, on the past. When I got back, they were gone. The house was burning. There was nothing left to bury. He fell silent. The story was complete. It explained everything. The desolate cabin, the solitary life, the haunted look in his eyes. The reason he had looked at her on that auction block and seen not a woman to be owned, but a soul to be saved. He was paying a debt the world had forgotten, trying to right a wrong that could never be undone. I couldn't save them, he whispered, the words so quiet she had to lean in to hear them. I'm sorry, she said, the words hopelessly inadequate. But they were all she had. He turned his head on the pillow and looked at her. Really looked at her. The last wall between them crumbled into dust. He was not her owner, her savior, or her protector. She was not his property, his ward, or his patient. They were just two people, survivors, who had found each other in the ruins. She reached out and placed her hand on his, the one that wasn't gripping the chair. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm. He did not pull away. They stayed like that as the sun rose higher, flooding the small cabin with the clean, bright light of a new day. Outside, the world needed to be cleaned up. There were grim tasks to be done. But in here, in the quiet of the room, something broken had begun to heal. The days that followed were quiet and filled with a somber, purposeful work. Together, they erased the scars of that violent night from the land. Elias, his arm in a sling, directed her with few words. They buried the Hollister men in a shallow gulch far from the cabin, marking the spot with a simple pile of stones, a grim monument to a dark chapter. They cleaned the porch, scrubbed the blood from the wood, and replaced the splintered shingles on the roof. They were not just cleaning. They were reclaiming their home, washing away the hatred and violence with their shared labor. The work was hard, but it was a healing balm. As Elias's shoulder healed, the dynamic between them settled into a new, comfortable rhythm. It was a partnership, easy and unspoken. He taught her how to properly split wood, showing her how to read the grain to make the work easier. She, in turn, managed the growing garden with a surprising skill, her hands coaxing life from the soil. They were building something more than a homestead. They were building a life, piece by piece. One evening, she sat on the porch, holding the small wooden bird he had given her. It had sat on the mantelpiece through the entire ordeal, a silent witness. She ran her thumb over its smooth, polished surface. Elias came and sat beside her, moving slowly. He was still stiff. He watched her for a moment, then looked out over the valley. The sun was setting, bathing the world in a soft, golden light. It was peaceful. My son, Elias said, his voice soft. He loved birds. He would have liked that. It was the first time he had spoken of his son as anything other than a loss. It was a small thing, a shared memory with the ghost, but it felt momentous. He was letting her into his past, into his grief. "What was his name?" Leela asked, her voice gentle. "Samuel," he said. The name hung in the air for a moment, full of love and sorrow. "And my wife was named Anna." He had given them back their names. He had let them live again, if only for a moment, in the quiet of the evening. Layla placed the wooden bird on the porch rail between them, a tribute to Samuel, a symbol of the new life they were building on the ashes of the old. The seasons began to turn. The heat of summer gave way to the crisp, cool air of autumn. The leaves on the aspens in the valley turned a brilliant, fiery gold. The harvest from the small garden was plentiful. They worked together to preserve it, storing vegetables in the small root cellar Elias had dug years ago. The cabin was filled with the smells of cooking and canning, the scent of a home preparing for winter. They had created a place of safety and abundance. The found family, a man hollowed by grief and a woman forged in resilience, had taken root. Their bond was not one of passion, but it was deeper than that. It was a quiet, unshakable love built on mutual respect, shared survival, and the profound comfort of a companionable silence. One day, Elias brought the old horse, saddled and ready, to the front of the cabin. He also led a second horse, younger and more spirited. "The town is a day's ride from here," he said, holding the reins of the new horse out to her. "You could be there by nightfall. From there, you can go anywhere you want. You are free, Lila." He said her name, and the sound of it in his voice was a gift. She looked at the horse. She looked at the trail that led out of the valley, out into the wide, unknown world. She was free. She could leave. She could start a new life, away from the ghosts and the violence of this place. But as she looked from the horse to the cabin, to the wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, to the neatly stacked firewood, to the man standing before her with his quiet strength and his deep, sad eyes, she knew she was already home. "This is where I want to be," she said. A slow smile touched Elias's lips. It was a rare, beautiful thing, like the sun breaking through clouds. He nodded, and together they led the horses back to the barn. And so their story continues, not in the thunder of violent confrontation, but in the quiet rhythm of passing seasons. The harsh winter came, blanketing the valley in a deep, silent snow. They were isolated, a single point of warmth in a vast, frozen world. The fire in the hearth was never allowed to die. It became the heart of their home, a symbol of the life they guarded together. They spoke more now, not with the empty chatter of lonely people, but with the shared stories and quiet observations of two souls who had learned each other's language. He told her of his life before, of the farm he had built with Anna, of the way his son Samuel could mimic the call of any bird he heard. She, in turn, spoke of her mother, of the small joys of a life before her father's gambling had consumed everything. They were excavating their pasts, not to dwell in them, but to understand the people they had become. When spring finally returned, melting the snow and breathing new life into the valley, it felt like a resurrection. They worked side by side to plant a larger garden. He built a new, sturdier chicken coop, and she filled it with clucking hens she bought from a traveling tinker, trading her finely knitted socks. Their homestead grew, not just in size, but in spirit. It was a place of healing, a testament to the fact that a life, like a broken fence, can be mended. The love between them was a quiet, deep-rooted thing. It was in the way he brought her a cup of hot tea in the morning, just as she liked it. It was in the way she mended his clothes, her stitches a silent language of care. It was in the shared glances across the dinner table, glances that held entire conversations. They had found in each other not a solution to their loneliness, but a companion to share it with. They had built a family from the broken pieces of two separate lives, proving that a home is not four walls, but the people you choose to shelter with. So here ends this chapter of their tale, a story born of violence and despair, which found its way to a quiet peace. It is a reminder that the deepest wounds can heal, that the most desolate landscapes can bloom, and that the value of a person can never be measured in coin. Before you go, consider this. What is a soul truly worth? Is it a debt to be collected? A property to be owned? Or is it something more, something that finds its true value only when it is given the freedom to heal, to build, and to love? The story of Elias and Lila suggests an answer, written not in words, but in the tending of a fire, the mending of a roof, and the simple, profound act of choosing to stay.